The coronavirus pandemic has touched every part of our lives, even the most intimate ways that we can relate socially, emotionally, and physically. I'm talking about sex. Now, thanks to technology, we're able to have some facsimile of a sex life through exchanging images and texts, and we were already moving towards cybersex as a daily part of our lives before the pandemic. But will it now be the future for the majority of Americans? And will our younger generations be relegated to experience intimacy through technology alone? Are we teaching our youth how to have safe sex or even safe cybersex, or are we leaving them to fend for themselves between abstinence only education in schools and the wild, unfettered access of the internet? Well, to answer those questions, I'm joined by sex educator Danielle Bezalel. Danielle has a master's of public health from Columbia University with expertise in sexuality and reproductive health. She's the creator, executive producer, and host of Sex Ed with DB, a feminist podcast bringing you all the sex ed you never got in school. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
So first, many singles are switching to cybersex, for example, sexting or exchanging images. Is there a safe way to do this?
This is a great question. So there are a few ways to think about participating in safe cybersex. So the first way that I think about this is really trusting your partner and thinking about communication and consent. So this includes not getting on Skype with someone that you don't know to have cybersex. This includes communicating in advance what you're willing to do and what you're willing not to do, stating your boundaries clearly, and maybe making sure that you trust your partner before you're about to engage with cybersex. And I say maybe because some of us may be feeling excited by a certain partner and wanting in the moment to have cybersex, but really at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have the utmost trust in that person who you're going to be experiencing that with. Another thing that I want to say here is that it's possible to have cybersex through texting or a phone call instead of through a video or sending images. So there are a couple of really awesome apps and websites that I want to shout out. The first one is Slutbot by a company called Juicebox. And that's a free virtual coach that shows you how to dirty talk over text. There's also wingmankeyboard.com by the Healthy Teen Network, which is a suggestive keyboard that's really similar. And talking on the phone, you can engage in simultaneous masturbation. I know it's kind of an old school way, but definitely still very sexy and spicy. The last thing that I want to say on this question is if you are going to send images and have sex over video, really just being aware of the potential consequences of that. So if you're sending nudes, maybe leaving your face out to de-identify yourself, and no matter what, just really being aware about the fact that there's potential for these nudes to be leaked.
Wow, and thank you so much for mentioning those websites too. Now, my next question for you is, do you think the pandemic is changing our sex lives, or was the trend towards cybersex inevitable?
Yeah, so I absolutely think that the pandemic is changing our sex lives, but the nature of that change is a lot more nuanced than you and I or anyone would think. So I want to shout out a recent study by Leisure Sciences, which was released in June, containing results from an online survey of over 1,500 adults who were asked specifically about the pandemic's impact on their intimate lives, and the results were fascinating. So unsurprisingly, nearly half of the participants reported a decline in their sex life, right? Which again, not surprising due to stress, anxiety, poor mental health that many of us are experiencing during not one, but two pandemics, of course, with the racial injustices that are happening, specifically that Black folks are experiencing in America. And something important though about this study, however, is that it concluded that 1 out of 5 participants reported expanding their sexual repertoire by incorporating new activities, and some of those activities did include cybersex, like sexting, sharing sexual fantasies, trying new positions, and participants making new additions were actually 3 times more likely to report improvements in their sex life, which is really awesome that people are experiencing positives. So what that says really to me is that people really are thinking about creative and fun ways to engage in sex with themselves and with a partner. Another recent article by the MIT Technology Review came out in March and talked about the fact that people are really engaging a lot with cybersex and with new gadgets. So, new sex toys, visiting virtual reality strip clubs, Zoom sex parties, really, even Pornhub. There's a specific type of porn, which is homemade videos that fetishize the coronavirus. Never thought that I'd see that. But, you know, everyone is obviously entitled to their own fun, and good for you if you're able to fetishize that and get a kick out of it. And then lastly on this question, and obviously this is anecdotal, but among my friends who are single, there doesn't really seem to be a clear trend one way or another. I feel like some aren't dating at all, like they're not even having any virtual sex, not really engaging, really focusing on me time. And then some are, shacking up with partners a little earlier than anticipated. So I think it really depends on many factors, including like comfortability, how much, again, you trust a partner, and how much you're willing to engage in some of the more like fun recent additions to cybersex, like those Zoom sex parties and whatnot.
Now, I want to follow up because I feel like we do have to address some of the negatives of cybersex and cyberspace. What kind of resources are there to prevent sexploitation or revenge porn or even being doxxed?
Yeah. So the most important thing I want to say on this question is never to blame the victim. I think it's really easy in our society and in our environment, to put blame on these people who are sending the photos or, are engaging in this type of behavior. But at the end of the day, like that, it's not their fault that they are being exploited sexually. It is the perpetrator's fault. So that's like first and foremost what I want to say. But again, even if you're using an encrypted app, even if the app is perfectly secure, as you said, there are some negatives, and photos and videos of yourself, nude or otherwise, can really, if it's put into the wrong hands, can have some negative consequences. So some resources that I want to chat about today are, obviously, there are legal resources. There are revenge porn lawyers. One famous one that's gotten a lot of attention is Carrie Goldberg, suing people for releasing their nudes or sexual harassment online. She started out doing more traditional sexual harassment, and she focuses specifically on revenge porn now. And she's the one that represented Katie Hill, a pretty famous revenge porn case. Also, I want to say consent-based sex education. I will say that a million times. That is a huge resource that we should be engaging with, including cyber safety and the difference between porn and real life sex that needs to be included in comprehensive sex education for young people, middle schoolers, high schoolers. Also, it's important to know the Google reverse image search function. So if you want to put your photo into Google image search, Google reverse image search, that's what it is, you can see if that photo has been posted on the internet, so it can put you in the know to make sure that that photo isn't being sent out where you don't want it. And the recent thing that I want to mention is an article by Jessica Valenti. I'm sure a lot of us have been following, about Aaron Coleman, who's a 19-year-old who's running for Kansas State House seat with multiple claims of abuse against him. And in this article, Valenti, the author, really talks about patterns of abuse. So really being able to recognize in your partner if they have a past history of abuse, of verbal abuse, emotional, financial, physical abuse, and they've shown misogyny and misogynistic behavior in the past, it's not unlikely that that behavior wouldn't continue. So really, as someone who's dating in the world, really trying to recognize red flags, that's something that everyone should be conscientious of and aware of.
I want to follow up on something you just said, which was about not blaming the victim. Do you think destigmatizing cybersex might be one step in the direction of making these kinds of sexual encounters safer?
Hard yes, times a million. I cannot stress this enough. But I really think that a lot has to happen in order for us to destigmatize cybersex, right? So I think of this question as an analogy to folks telling kids, youth, not to have sex. As many, many studies have shown, the average age of first sex in America is 17 years old. So I think it's pretty clear that you can tell that kids are indeed having sex, right? So that being said, we should be equipping kids with the knowledge, the tools, the resources to do it safely. And the same thing with nudes, right? You can tell kids, adults, don't send nudes all you want. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with impulses, social pressures, the desire to be closer and intimate with your partner. Or let's be clear, people can just take nudes because they want to. They don't have to do it for a partner. They can do it for themselves to document them feeling sexy. That is their prerogative as a person in this world to be able to appreciate their own body. And again, at the end of the day, those nudes, if they, get into the wrong hands, they can be released to the world. And, another part of that conversation I mentioned before is former representative of California, Katie Hill, who was, exposed by her abusive ex-husband. And there are many, many young women and men and non-binary folks in the world who have nudes. And if we judged everyone based on them having nudes and saying these people can't get a job because they have nudes, like no one would be able to work, because a majority of people, I guarantee it, and this is backed up by, I'm going to find you a source. I don't have one at the moment, but people have nudes. And I think the bottom line really is that this form of communication and intimacy isn't going anywhere. So we really need to start unpacking it and destigmatizing it.
Okay, well, let me just delve into politics for a moment. Now, Vice President Mike Pence said in 2002, quote, condoms are very, very poor protection against sexually transmitted diseases. And he's also worked against protections and rights for the LGBTQ community and has promoted abstinence-only education. How has the Trump-Pence White House affected the work of sex educators? How has it impacted them?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, I want to respond to the condoms thing, because that's a lie. Condoms are a very, very effective way to prevent pregnancy and STIs, with regular use over 85%, with perfect use over 95%. So let's just demystify that right now. And, that's a myth. But what I also know is that Trump and Pence have invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into abstinence-only education in America, which is proven time and time again to be ineffective and not work. As we already talked about, the average age of first sex in the US is 17. People are going to have sex. Kids are going to have sex and experiment. Abstinence only makes it so they're embarrassed and ashamed to ask questions. And that's why abstinence only has been thriving, because of religion and that there's a marriage there. So also what I want to say about that is globally, the global gag rule, Trump ensured that people abroad, if they accepted American funding, were not only not allowed to talk about abortion and other necessary reproductive health services, but if they received global funding from the US, they weren't then allowed to offer these other services. So this funding and these laws, the global gag rule, didn't only impact the US, but really impacted so many other necessary services that folks abroad are offering to women, to young people, to trans folks, to LGBTQ folks. And it is detrimental and has caused folks to go underground to get abortions. It has caused, STI rates to skyrocket. It has caused unwanted pregnancy rates to skyrocket. And again, actually, there was a recent study done by the Trevor Project, and I believe that over 80% of LGBTQ youth's mental health has been impacted, self-reported negatively because of everything currently that's going on with Trump during the pandemic, all the horrible, hateful rhetoric that Trump spews about LGBTQ youth. So long story short, I wish I had the exact numbers and everything like that. But what we do know is that it has a very tangible effect, specifically on minority communities, on women, on LGBTQ folks, on Black and brown people. And it's not going away if he continues to be in office.
Now, Danielle, my last question for you is this. You educate people about sex every day. What are 3 things you would want the public to know?
Oh God, as you probably know, I would love for a million things to be on this list, but I'll kind of keep it at 3. So my first general bubble is around consent, right? I want folks to know, especially young people, your body is yours and no one else is allowed to have access to it unless you give them an enthusiastic yes. Yes means yes, right? Consent can also be taken back at any time. It's reversible. It's more nuanced, obviously, than a yes means yes. It can't be during someone, coercing you into sex or into any sort of act. And it needs to be conscious. The person giving a yes needs to be fully aware and have all of their, all of their capabilities. And with that consent and owning your body comes being comfortable in your own skin, right? I think about consent and body image to be really tied together, getting everyone, especially kids and youth, to feel beautiful and smart and wonderful and confident in their own skin is wildly important. The second thing I want to say is really redefining sex. There are so many different kinds of sex out there and different ways to have sex. Safe sex especially. Penis vagina sex is not the only kind of sex, and typically in our scripts of TV and books and movies we usually only see that kind of sex until recently, where more films and TV shows are delving into that. But with that comes around the education around condoms and birth control, right? And then really making sure that all sex and gender and the sexuality spectrum is discussed. So I think like that whole bubble of redefining sex, redefining gender, thinking about the spectrum, and just knowing that there are so many different ways to express sex, love, and intimacy. And the final thing I would say is pleasure. In general, that pleasure is the key to everything, whether you're in a friendship, a romantic relationship, a sexual experience. These should all be pleasurable to you and not harmful. So there are so many different ways to experience pleasure, including self-pleasure that has to do with masturbation, right? And then finally, of course, I would be remiss to not mention the orgasm gap. As you may or may not know, if a straight couple has sex 100 times on average, the cis male person will orgasm 95 times, the cis woman will orgasm 65 times. This is a huge, huge issue. And this is definitely backed up by studies. So I think like really making sure that pleasure, especially for queer people, for women, for cis women, that they know that their pleasure is super important. And I think, last line, I think schools should teach about the clitoris. I think that is like one of the most important things.
Danielle, thank you so much for joining me. And I just have to recommend to everyone who watched this interview to please take a look at the Sex Ed with DB podcast and take a listen to get more information about how to have safe sex and how to enjoy sex and how to expand your understanding of sex. And I just have to thank you, Danielle, so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Taya.
My name is Taya Graham, and I'm a reporter for the Real News Network. Be safe out there.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.